I grew up watching Murder She Wrote, Madlock. Um, there was I felt like there was another one that we watched sometimes, but definitely Sunday, Madlock, and Murder She Wrote whenever that came on. And during the early months of the pandemic, in lockdown, can't go anywhere, I started watching stuff on Prime that I hadn't watched in decades. And and I
How
was
did it
trying to
how did it hold up?
it doesn't hold up as well. I still kind of watched episode after episode, but after like the second one or maybe the third one, I'm like, oh, okay, they showed it, they introduce you to the killer in the first few minutes. They make a quick appearance and then you don't see him again for a while. So it didn't hold up, but it was, it was still kind of, it was something to do. Um, but yeah, the book originally was there were not going to be any murders. The piece about homophobia, basically everything that the three POV characters. I know there are four POV characters, but I'm talking about Eunice, Savannah, and Ted. They were going to have the same issues with each other and in their lives, but there wasn't a murder, involved at all. But it felt like I was writing three novellas, you know, and I couldn't get them to. I kept asking myself, yeah, so what? So Ted has a daughter who married a black man, and he doesn't want to, he loves her, but he doesn't want to speak to her because of the reputation, blah, blah. Yeah, so what? Eunice has a gay son. She's homophobic. You know, I needed to I was just having a hard time writing the book. I was bored with it. And again, it felt like three separate books that I was trying to force them together with the setting. Um, and then I decided, watching the shows, I was actually telling my partner, I said, I'm bored. I don't know how to make Eunice's part matter that much to Savannah, and Savannah's part matter that much to Ted, aside from them being father and daughter and all that stuff. And I said, maybe I should throw in a murder and pull some Murder She Wrote type stuff. And he said, that's a good idea. Why don't you do that? And I was like, okay, I might. And now I got to figure out how to make all three of those characters um, implicated in some way. But that's totally how it came about. My deadline was getting closer, and I was miserably bored. I just felt like I had written three short projects, and was trying to make them work together.
Well, it's never a good sign when you yourself are bored with your own book, but it's
Yeah,
also a good sign that you notice it and that you're willing to admit it to yourself. I think sometimes writers resist
yeah,
that fact. It
right.
can be painful to admit that your book is boring, but it's better to realize that early than to realize it when it's too late, right?
Yeah, yeah. My original editor at the time, she was fine with it not having a murder in it, at all. She was fine with that. Um, I think her advice was kind of to raise the stakes in each part. But that was the thing. I didn't know how to raise. I was like, how much more can you raise the stakes? And it just kind of felt like it would have gotten very cliche. Like, for example, Leroy may have ran away. So have tons of gay queer teenagers. Again, so what? And I didn't want to write another book about queer boy runs away from homophobic town and parents. Woman woman with biracial children, they don't fit in. Father whose daughter married outside of the community. Like, those are everyday stories, I feel like. And so I think adding the triple murder um, helped. I really did. It helped me. That's
Well,
for sure.
listen, there is a reason why true crime it has exploded as its own genre and has
Yeah.
become so popular. And it's because it is dramatic and it does draw you in. And there's a lurid aspect to it, but there's also at least in the way that it's often presented, and as it is presented in most popular narratives, uh, uh, a contained vessel. This is the way I
Mm,
always characterize it to myself. You know, people want to know what happened.
right.
And so there is this kind of narrative structure that's sort of ready-made when it comes to a murder mystery, especially if, you know, if you're drawing it from real life and the murder has been solved. But
Hmm.
even if it hasn't, I think the unsolved aspect can be interesting to people as well. You get people who try to become online sleuths or whatever, but
Right.
you're kind of writing about a character who, it's not an online sleuth, but you do have this character, Josephine, who kind of takes on the responsibility of being a amateur detective to try to absolve her love interest. And
Yeah.
I gotta give you a shout out for naming your characters. I think you do an excellent job of doing so. But this
Thank
guy's
you.
name is Limp. His name is
Yeah.
Olympus Seymour, but everybody calls him Limp, and I like that as a character name. It felt very unique, but it also felt like, I don't know, it made him seem believable, and it seemed like the kind of name that a guy from West Mills would have.
Yeah.
It just felt like of a place. So,
Right.
you know, you make this decision to turn this into a murder mystery, and I also read that you, I think, built the circumstances of the murder, at least in part, from something that had occurred in your hometown, or it grew out of that.
Right.
And I want to say,
Yes.
in an original draft, hadn't people died by drowning, and
By
then
drowning
you switched it to being
to
a
murder.
homicide with a gun.
Yeah. 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 There were so this happened in the 70s. I wasn't quite born yet. But my mom and her sisters were talking about it a few years before I started writing the book about these ladies, these three elderly ladies who carpooled a lot. They were going to church on this particular morning. And as one of the ladies lived right up against the canal, and at this particular time, there weren't guards, these like heavy steel guards to keep from people to drive from driving over into the canal and that sort of thing. And something happened with the car. Of course, no one will ever know whether the lady who was driving, if her shoe malfunctioned or whatever, or if it was brakes or whatever. But they backed into the canal and they drowned.
Oy.
And they were three old women. One was a hairdresser. That's all I can remember about what my mom told me about the three ladies. But she knew their names and everything. But one was a hairdresser. Um, but yeah, so they drowned, and I was fascinated because I had never heard about that story, and I thought it was horrible that there was nothing to protect anyone from just driving over into the canal, and so I decided to do something with that. So in the original draft of the book, the women had drowned it, and I turned them into siblings. By the way, I turned them into Marion, Laz, and Marva, and then each of the POV characters had a friendship or a beef or something with them, and so that was sort of their inner turmoil. But again, it bored me because okay, um, Eunice took her son to see the doctor. The doctor drowned. Like what? It was an accidental death. Why is she in turmoil? And the same with Savannah and Ted. The stakes for me just weren't high enough. I mean, I suppose for Ted there could have been. I won't give away too much, but for Ted's part, I imagine his. If there was no murder, just the drowning alone could affect him. He was in love, but
With
the
Marion.
other with Marion, yeah. But for the other two, an accidental drowning when they're pissed off with them, so problem solved.
Right.
You can, there's no who are they going to be mad at now.
Hmm.
So yeah, so it had to be changed to a murder. Had to be for me.
And how long of a time period elapsed between the initial draft and the initial concept for the book to when you made this shift into triple homicide murder mystery? Like, how long were you in the wilderness with this book before you
Yeah,
finally
yeah.
locked in on it?
I would say from fall of 2019 until about November or so of 2020. Yeah.
So a year.
Yeah. Yeah.
How was that for you? Because it can be stressful when you're working on a book, but you don't have it by the tail.
Right. It was stressful. I did a lot of procrastinating. I would write scenes just so the word count would grow. I would write scenes and then I'd be like, this scene is useless. It might have been fun to write it for a day or two, but it's useless. So my wheels just spun for a year. And at that point, um, I knew I needed an extension, which it had already been extended because of COVID. They're like, we're giving everybody extensions on their books. Um, but I'm not the type of person who asks for extensions, So I was ready to get it done, and but it was miserable. It was miserable, and I found that I leaned more into teaching during that time because it was like the excuse. I don't have time to write. I got 75 students. I had always had 75 students, even writing the first book. So that's when I realized that something had to change. I had to get out of the wilderness. Yeah.
Well, for anybody out there listening who is in the wilderness right now, the lesson here is just to add a triple homicide to your story.
Right.
Problem solved.
Yeah.
You have said that in a past interview that if you had to summarize this book in one sentence, I believe this is correct. This is in regards to Decent People. You said, everyone is a victim of patriarchy. And I think that the mask that we put on, all people of all genders, a lot of that mask is to protect us from patriarchy or to protect ourselves in some way.
Yes.
So can you
Yeah.
elaborate a little bit on that with respect? Because this is, on the surface, it's a murder mystery, but what you're
Hmm.
talking about here speaks to deeper concerns.
Yeah. So with I'll kind of go in order. I think that, and I'll start with Eunice. I think at the end of the day, if homophobia
And,
wasn't a
and can you
problem.
explain for listeners who haven't had a chance to read who Eunice is in broad strokes?
Oh yeah. So Eunice Loving she's a African American woman in her late 30s, I think. She's a grocery store owner. She inherited it from her parents, and she's a church going lady. She's a singer, a choir director, a pillar of the community type person, and she cares what people think of her. Her and her family. She is a child of adoption. She is not very proud of who her birth mother is. So one of her big missions in life is to be upstanding and to not in any way have her biological mother's shame intrude on her own life or her family's life. And so when it becomes clear to her that her son is queer, she can't handle it, and she needs it fixed, for her reputation and the family's reputation, but also for his safety. She believes that this will make him safe. Um, so where the patriarchy piece comes in for her is the homophobia part of it. Like if she didn't have to contend with if she nor her son had to contend with homophobia and the threats that that come along with that, whether it be physical or financial, social, all of that, then she wouldn't have made the choices that she did, you know. And so that's why I see her as a victim of patriarchy. With Savannah, it's similar, not with a queer son, but with her
Savannah
marrying.
being,
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Savannah. So Savannah is a white lady in her mid to late 30s. Savannah was born and raised there in up a well-to-do white family on the east side of town. Her father's was wealthy. She comes from a wealthy family, and she meets a young black man back in the 60s. They fall in love. They run off to New York to elope. They get, they have two children. He dies suddenly and young. And then she is, due to financial reasons, she is forced to move back to the town of West Mills, where she and her children will, stick out like sore thumbs. And her children are involved. Her children are used as pawns in this homophobic tactic. Now, where patriarchy sort of affects her is that she married a black man in the 60s, and so that alone is just like a big strike against her and her future, especially there in the town of West Mills. um so she's struggling to protect her children, be a good mom, to not be bullied, but she also at some point sort of succumbs to patriarchy and becomes a part of patriarchy and some decisions she makes and atones for towards the end of the novel. And and Ted, who happens to be her father, Ted is he's a business owner, landowner, most of it inherited. uh, Ted feels that he has just always lived in the shadows of his father and his older brother, and that everything he has pretty much came from them. He's never really made many decisions on his own, except for meeting the wife that he had and having a daughter, but he lives in his mother's mansion and that sort of thing. Um, and so he falls in love in the current part of the present day part of the novel. He falls in love with someone who the town would not approve of. And so he becomes a victim of patriarchy, even though he definitely has some racist tendencies and stuff, but he becomes a victim of patriarchy because he can't he can't live the life he wants to live unless it is in line with white supremacy, basically. And so I just think that all of the characters, maybe so much Joe's part, she is, I mean, of course she's a victim of it just by living in the world during that time, but she's the most free of all of them, I think.
Joe being
Joe
the
being our sleuth.
protagonist,
Yeah. Yeah.
and she is the one who is engaged to Limp, like
Right.
romantically involved with Limp, and is basically trying to exonerate him because people believe he might be the killer. That's kind of where the
Yes.
novel opens.
Hmm.
And you've alluded to, it's interesting to hear you talk about this cast of characters so intimately because it doesn't happen all that often on this show, which might seem strange because novelists do become intimate with their characters. But for you, it seems particularly so. This novel is the second novel that you've written. Both are set in this fictional town of West Mills
Hmm.
in North Carolina.
Yes.
And you speak of it like these people are real.
Yeah.
And one of the effects of this book on me as a reader was that I felt like I moved there.
Mm.
I had to get to know everybody. There's a bit of a process of orientation where you're keeping track of the names and the connections and the family connections and this, that, and the other. And it
Yeah.
feels very much how it is to perhaps integrate yourself into a small town because
Hmm.
in a small town, everybody sort of knows everybody else, right?
That's
And
right.
everybody's interacted with everybody and everybody's kind of up in each other's business one way or
Yeah.
another. And that
Yeah.
that is how it must feel. I mean, you must feel like, and I know you grew up in a town similar to West Mills. So
Yeah.
I'd love to hear you just talk about the your upbringing in small town North Carolina and how it informed the construction of this fictional version.
Sure. I grew up in Elizabeth City, North Carolina, which is right next door to a small town called South Mills, North Carolina. South Mills is where my mother was born and raised, and it is really, it's an 8 minute drive. Elizabeth City and South Mills may as well be one city, one county. Um, but it is one of those communities, both South Mills and Elizabeth City, where I was actually born and raised, has grown some, so people don't know each other as as much. But I'll just I'll talk about this the 80s, the 90s. When I was aware, it is a town where people know. They may not know your name, they may not remember your name, but they know that you are so and so's grandchild, or so and so's nephew, and that you go to so and so church, and that they know enough to know who to call to ask if they want more information, you know, and it can be hard. It can be hard living in a place like that. I think my mom would probably disagree, um, or maybe she wouldn't. But I, it is a place where it is hard to have any anonymity, and you can't be too different
I
in
was
a
going to
small.
say, I was going to
Yeah,
say, growing up in a place like South Mills, North Carolina, which is that near the Virginia border? I was trying to
it
place
is.
it.
Hmm.
So that's where you grew up, and to grow up as a queer kid in that
Yeah,
kind of environment, culturally,
yeah.
spiritually, had to be challenging.
It is. It is. The homophobia comes from every direction imaginable, and it's not just from, I think what surprises people a lot, I think when I talk about the homophobia, the bullying I received, I think people expect me just to talk about the kids, but I received a lot of verbal bullying from grown-ups. It was so commonplace. It really
Because why?
was.
Can you describe like a scenario? Like you're what? You're just out and about
Yeah, let's say
minding.
for example, I met because I did play with other kids in the community. Um, so on a summer day, if I am at a friend's house, which is a few houses away or whatever, and we're out in the yard playing kickball, and if one of their parents or grandparents or an adult that just happens to be sitting outside and just kind of watching us, um, I would be called a faggot because I had said or done something effeminate, you know, and it could be like posture while I'm waiting for the person to kick the ball, something I'm totally not thinking about, totally unaware of because I'm just waiting for the ball to be kicked so I can run and catch it or whatever. And someone's mom would be like, "Why are you standing like that? You a faggot," you know? And I had to hear this sort of stuff so much that it really, I think I became desensitized to it for a while. And I think the older I got, as I reached like high school, then I would think back on it and I'd be like, wow, I was bullied by an adult, multiple adults, you know, a lot of, a lot, you know. Um, so yeah, it was not easy. I had a good life, a good childhood outside of that stuff. I had great parents. My parents, they made mistakes, obviously, um, but I was very well taken care of. I grew up in a two-parent home. Both of my parents always worked. They owned property, and that sort of thing. So I was not poor. My life was good in other ways, Um, but boy, was I emotionally and verbally screwed.
Well,
you know
I think I read that you understood that you were gay at a relatively young age and that your parents knew at a
yeah.
relatively young age, which isn't, I mean, generationally, I think we're pretty close. I was born in 75.
Hmm.
So I think you might be
79.
okay. So you're a bit younger, but same kind of deal. And I think for us generationally, especially in a place like South Mills or in the town that I grew up in Indiana, people were not out
Yeah,
typically. And
yeah.
it was not uncommon at all for people to be in the closet all throughout high school and even into college and beyond. But it sounds like that was not the case for you, which in the context of South Mills would seem to me at least to be interesting and possibly a bit unique.
Well, I was in the closet. I didn't, I told one person I was gay, and I think I was in the 10th grade, um, or maybe ninth grade. I came out to one person, and that was because she was also queer. But I was effeminate, you know, um, in ways that I think people just couldn't ignore. And so it was assumed, even though I had like two girlfriends in high school, and they were beards, of course. And I think both of those girlfriends, for example, I think they knew fully that I was gay, but I think they enjoyed my company. I think they were, for lack of a better word, my fag hags. you know
You were the
but
safe crush. You were their
I
safe
was,
crush.
yeah, I was a safe crush. They didn't have to do anything. you know
Right.
um and but yeah, they knew. And my mom, even though she did not, when I did come out, she denied knowing it. But I said to her, I said, "You knew?" And she said, "No, I didn't." And I said, "You did know. You knew because you once asked me if I was into girls." And I said, "You wouldn't have asked that if you didn't have, some kind of inkling." And I think we just kind of ended the conversation there. But when I came out, um, to them, which was right after high school, maybe 6 months out of high school, I left home and I came out over the phone, and my mom had a meltdown, and that's why I was like, I don't understand this meltdown. You knew,
But
but
now
my
now it's
father,
official though. Now it's
right?
official.
Yeah, yeah. And but my dad was surprisingly cool as a cucumber. He was really cool. He did ask me. He had one request, well, two. He had two requests. One was to not catch a disease that would kill me, and two,
Fair.
yeah, and two, and two was to try with with girls in case this was a phase. And I said, I just told him, okay.
Okay, Dad. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But that seems I mean, in the scheme of things, that seems relatively easy as a coming out story. You hear
Yes,
tales of parental rejection and parents having, much more intense meltdowns.
absolutely. Yeah, I consider myself lucky. I really do.
So what
Yeah.
about I'm thinking of South Mills and that part of the country and the church going nature of a place like that. And
Hmm.
obviously, church going can color one's perspective on homosexuality.
Oh, yeah.
What kind of spiritual tradition were you raised in?
I was raised in the Baptist church. Yeah,
Not
yeah.
a friendly place to gay people, right?
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, in the church that I went to, I don't believe there was definitely no openly gay people. And I don't even think there were any people that were suspected of being gay in the church that I
Not even
went
the pastor?
to. Not even the pastor.
I'm joking.
In the other parts of town, there were men who were known to be gay. They were, um, I guess they were out. Yeah, they had partners, but it was very few, because I think most people just left. So I can maybe think of three men who, one of them was my mother's, was a classmate of my mother, so he, much older than me. But maybe three men I knew in town, or knew of, who were gay. That, like, they were gay. There was no question about it. They lived with a man, that sort of thing. But yeah, but to the point of the church, that clouded everything I thought about myself, for, the whole time, from the moment I knew that I was different to the time I left home. You know, I was constantly praying to be changed. It's very typical, the story of most black men raised in the church. We pray to be changed. We pray that it will go away. Why can't we just be straight and be normal? And then I think for most of us, hopefully at some point we say, fuck it. I'm not praying to be changed anymore, if I'm praying at all. you know?
Right. Yeah. So what
Yeah.
happened? You left the church, I would imagine?
Yeah. I didn't leave the church right away. I kept I kept going even after I left home. I continued to go to church, but what I did is I found church. I found a church that first church I went to after leaving home. I found a church where a lot of gay people went to. Yeah, and there was
What, a
homophobia there.
Baptist church or
In a
a?
Baptist church. Yeah, it was
Whoa.
called Orange Grove Baptist in Durham, North Carolina. It was a big congregation, so you could get
But more welcoming.
but more welcoming. Yeah, yeah. So I was a member there for a few years, maybe 2 years, and the very liberal progressive pastor left, and so a lot of us left with him. Yeah. And then I didn't go to church for a while, and then I moved to New York and found another big church where I had a lot of queer people, and went there for 3 or 4 years, and then eventually I decided I didn't want to go to church at all.
Okay. So why?
My views on religion started to sharpen, I will say. And I started to think more closely about the contradictions. And it just became clear to me that I believed what I believed because I had been taught to believe that, you know. Um, but I don't quite call myself an atheist, but I'm really close to it. I'm really close to it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I just don't know. I'm not prepared to say definitively. I mean, really, the
Yeah.
question is what happens when we die, right? Like
Right.
that's,
Right.
I don't know. I have
Yeah.
some suspicions, but like I'm not going to stand up and start
Right.
stumping for them. I'm
Yeah.
trying to stay a little bit more humble than that. But you have a bit of a historian in you. I mean,
Hmm.
part of your interest in, like, it makes sense to me that a young black queer kid from a small town in the American South would, as a fiction writer later in his life, write novels that take place in a fictionalized version of this town where you can kind of excavate, you can rework, you can explore the place kind of on your own terms
Yeah.
and get a chance to put some of these characters who existed in your real life under the microscope.
Hmm.
And you get to see their humanity, you also in all of its variances, the
Yeah.
good, the bad, and the ugly.
Right.
Is that on track, like this historical impulse that you have that goes along with the kind of fiction that you've written so far?
Absolutely. I think one thing I try to do in my work is I try to show that no one is all good and no one is all bad. And I take that from Toni Morrison. When I started reading her work, I fell in love. I think well, Beloved was the first book I read, but when I read Sula and then later read an interview she gave about it, um, and then an essay someone wrote about that, I I learned that no human being can be all good, all bad, and in this essay, and I think she even did in the interview, cited examples from the books, and I was like, I want to do that in my work because that's real life. That's real life. And some of us are only 3% bad and some of us are 30, you know,
Right.
but,
I'm now
but we,
wondering what my percentage is. I don't know what
yeah.
I'm.
But I said I just can't write a book where any character is just a hero, just a plain hero and have never done anything wrong and only have pure thoughts about other people, it's just a lie. And so yeah, I try to do that in my work. Yeah.
People are complicated,
Absolutely.
and I think that is the right impulse as a fiction writer. I mean, you're not going to write very interesting books. I mean, maybe you could write like a comic book or some sort of
Yeah,
superhero narrative, but
exactly.
I think even superheroes these days are flawed, right? We always
Yeah.
have the superhero with some sort of complicated personal
Right.
situation or flaw.
Absolutely.
And I think that it's an honest appraisal of the situation that you grew up in, which in many respects was tough. Like you were mistreated and even abused by elders in your community. I think that there could be some temptation to simply cast them as villains, pure and
Hmm.
simple. Do you know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
Like they're the
Yeah.
they are, to use the what is it, the black hats and the white hats. I guess that's a racialized way of putting it, but you know what I'm saying. There's the bad guys and the good guys,
Yeah.
and you are resisting that dichotomy.
Yeah. That's too easy, you
And
know.
Toni Morrison was a big influence in getting you headed in that
Abs-
direction.
Absolutely.
Is
Yeah.
there anybody else?
Um, let's see. I think characters in Alice Walker's book, for example, I think Shug Avery. Shug Avery is a really good example. Shug Avery is a woman who she loves she loves other women. She wants to uplift other women, but she also slept with Ceely's husband. You know, she was like, "Well, I met him first, and I have kids by him. I don't care that you're his husband. I mean, that you're his wife, and I know that he beats on you, and that's not great. But guess what? I still love him, you know, and I'm still going to sleep with him." So she was a very complicated character, and I loved her. I love that character in The Color Purple. So yeah, that's the first one that comes to mind. There are probably other characters in that same book, you know, but I love a character who has been naughty and has been nice. Yeah,
Well, it's more fun to read about, and it is interesting when
absolutely.
it's fun to develop affection
Right.
for these people. You sort of, I think we see ourselves. Maybe we see it like we see our own complexities, even if they aren't like an exact mirror image. It's like
Exactly.
that's just how people are. That's how we
Right.
ourselves are, if we're being honest about it.
Yeah.
And in this novel, you have portrayed a kind of common migratory pattern for Black people from the American South heading north. Like
Hmm.
Josephine and her brother Herschel had left West Mills to go up to New York, where they lived in Harlem. Not an
Hmm.
easy life in
Right.
Harlem. Maybe
Right.
it was easier, maybe for Herschel, who himself is a gay man.
Yes.
Josephine's brother, her older brother. And then in this book, you have Josephine returning to the land of her youth, to the town of her youth. It's a
Hmm.
big change to go back and forth, but it's not uncommon for
Right.
Black people, especially of a certain generation, to leave the American South to head north, be it to a place like Chicago or Detroit or
Hmm.
Harlem.
Right. Yeah.
But then to go
Yeah.
in reverse and go home, not necessarily the easiest path.
Right.
Herschel wants nothing to do with it, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah. And and he tells her, I don't know if you'll like it once you're down there, because she was so young when they left the South. So you know, she's smart enough to know that there was Jim Crow and all that stuff, but because she just didn't experience it so much firsthand, she sees the South as this tranquil place where there'd be green grass all the time and no sirens and that sort of thing. Um, and he's like, "Well, yeah, you don't know the South." Yeah, but I did that in the book. Because historically it's true that a lot of people, move to the north and then they come back when they get older because their money can stretch further. But it happened in my family. My maternal grandparents moved to New York, had a bunch of kids. They had some of them up here and some of them in the South, and they didn't stay together. But my grandmother, she went back. Yeah, and my grandfather stayed here and died here.
Are you in Harlem?
Well, I'm in New York. I'm in New Jersey.
Oh, you're in
Yeah,
New Jersey. Okay.
yeah. Hmm.
And in terms of the changes, because we are in this book operating in a different time period. Uh, and so, like what we were talking about, like the South Mills of your youth versus the South Mills of today. Like when you go back home, if you do go back down there,
Hmm.
have there been any systemic changes over the decades, or is it pretty much the same? And I know these places tend to be a little bit resistant to change, and sometimes they can be behind the times a bit in terms of the kind of social and cultural changes that might be in effect in a place like New York City.
Yeah, I don't go home very often. Um, I probably go to my hometown once every 2 years, unless there's a reason to go. But I would say, sadly, that things have not changed there very much culturally, and socially. I don't see it. And from what my peers, which are mostly my cousins, who still live nearby, they would tell me the same thing, that things don't seem to have changed very much. Yeah.
Now, you talked about earlier being bullied when you were a kid growing up there, and you write about Leroy, who is Eunice's son, and she's
Hmm.
trying to both protect him, and she's also freaked out by the fact that he's queer, and like tries to get treatment for him, conversion therapy essentially for
Yeah.
him. When you were growing up, was conversion therapy uh, like something that was happening around you? Was it a possibility that you were confronted with at any point?
No, not in any kind of formal sense. It was mostly a religious prayer type of thing. You know, I had well, first of all, I want to say that my parents never came to me and said, we got to figure out a way to get you fixed. That never happened. But I do believe conversations happened, you know, um, uh, between my mother and religious figures, because sometimes I would go to church and a pastor or someone, high up the chain would pull me aside and say, let me just pray with you for a minute, brother. And I'd just be like, what is this about? And then later on, I would, as I got older, I would be like, oh, I see. My mom probably asked him to do that. And I had an uncle, my mom's baby brother. He was a pastor, extremely, extremely devout. And whenever I visited his house, because his kids are around my age, sometimes he would pull me in the kitchen, and we sit at the kitchen table, and he would just put his hands on my shoulders or whatever and just launch into a prayer about protection. And so I was
Here's,
like, okay.
I gotta say, that would have freaked me out if I was. That doesn't offer me any comfort. Somebody does that
Right.
to me, I'm like, okay, I got to get out of here. Like, get your.
Yeah,
Like the intentions are probably,
of
somewhat
course.
positive, but I
Yeah.
just that
In
sort
the
of stuff.
moment. Right. In the moment, it didn't feel weird. Sometimes I wouldn't realize what had happened for a year and a half later. Like, oh, I think my mom asked him, will you pray for him while he's down there?
Mm.
you know? Yeah.
I
So
grew up
it,
with some of that. I grew up in a big Catholic family, and down my folks are from Louisiana, so I know that.
mhm.
Will you please pray for him? That's been happening all throughout my life, and I'm just like, I don't know, is it working? How do things look? But I also have a distinct memory of being in North Carolina when I was a young man hiking on the Appalachian Trail, which my listeners have heard me talk about many times. But there was this. I was in a meadow. I think I was eating lunch. I was in this kind of. It was like there were some trees, but it was a little bit clear, is what I remember. It was a beautiful spot. That's why I stopped there. And I
Mhm.
had been eating, and then a big group of young kids and some kind of camp counselor age people sort of happened upon me,
Okay.
and we started talking, and within like 5 minutes it was like, brother, can we pray for you? Because I'm in North Carolina, and whenever anybody asks me that, I always say yes. I mean, like, what am I going
Yeah.
to say? Like, I
Sure.
guess no, so I'm just like, sure, bring it on.
Yeah.
They encircled me and held hands. And I'm just like, I mean, I have like a beard like out to here. I've been in
Hmm.
the woods for the whole summer, and I'm just like, wow. And they kind of sat there like with an apple in my hand or whatever, while these
Right.
people just prayed for me.
Yeah. Yeah. They believe in an impromptu prayer.
They love it. They love it.
Yeah.
So I want to talk to you about some of the thematic concerns of this book that we haven't touched upon yet. And the one in particular that I want to zero in on is the power of secrets.
Hmm.
I think this is really fascinating. And I think it is something that touches most human lives. And I feel like the corrosive power of secrets in human experience is something that maybe doesn't get talked about enough. Human
Yeah,
beings are secretive creatures,
very much so.
and we often bury things.
Yeah.
And we bury things, I think, in a self protective impulse or even in a protective impulse that extends to others. Like there's a generosity in it, even if it is misguided. Do you know what I'm
Hmm.
saying? Like we're
Hmm.
not going to talk about that. I don't want the kids to know because we want to protect them and keep their innocence or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it often backfires.
Right.
And when people are carrying secrets around, I think it's like an albatross, right? It's like it weighs you down, it colors the interactions that you have with others. And I
Yes.
think ultimately what it does is it prevents you from having authentic relationships with the people, oftentimes with the people you care about the most.
Absolutely.
And it just gets heavier and harder the longer it goes on.
Hmm.
Do you believe
Hmm.
that? I mean, am I making
No.
sense?
Yeah. Absolutely. Um, like an example that comes to mind from the novel is that once Eunice makes the decision to seek help and realizes that she can't tell her husband that she has done it, she has to interact differently with him. She has to lie to him, you know, about where she was and that sort of thing. And like that scene when she comes back in from going to when she considered go to do harm. She comes in, she's like, "Oh, I just had to go to the store," but he can tell that that's not quite true. He doesn't press, you know.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, that's just one of the examples that come to mind. But yeah, I do think that when we are trying to keep a secret for whatever reason, whether it's to save someone else or save ourselves, I think that it does create a lot of tension, um, a lot of lies. You know, you're lying to cover up things and that sort of thing. But yeah, I think it works well in fiction. That I learned from my teacher Margot Livesey. She had a seminar when I went to University of Iowa, and she teaches there.
To the
And she
Iowa
had
Writers Workshop.
yes, the Iowa Writers Workshop, and she had a seminar on fiction that she teaches often. And one of the things that she advised was to add in some secrets because characters, as we just discussed, it changes the way people react with other people, interact with other people when they are hiding something. You know, and so I went crazy with the first book. I went crazy with the secrets. I was like, everyone's gonna be hiding something, you know. Um, so it's a very good plot device, and I decided to use it again.
I think most of us have experience with this,
Yeah.
where you find something out about somebody you know that they had been hiding. It is destabilizing.
Hmm.
It's also very humbling. That has been my
Right.
experience. Like you think you're a writer and you have great observational powers and you
Hmm.
know what's going on around you and you have this kind of advanced intuition, like all the
Hmm.
ways writers can conceive of themselves. But then you find out that one of your closest friends has been doing things you had no idea that they had been doing. And it really throws you. And it's not
Yeah.
what's interesting to me is that it's not necessarily a moral judgment that results, though
Right.
maybe that's part of it. But usually when it's someone close to you, when you find out, it isn't that you're offended in a moral sense. It's that you're destabilized because you realize you didn't see them nearly as clearly as you thought that you did.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that feeling alone is powerfully unpleasant.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I got to believe that it's powerfully unpleasant to have to maintain the ruse.
Yes.
And it's also really troubling how good some people are at it.
I know.
I mean, to be able to carry a really serious lie or a really serious secret around with you in your day to day for years, for lifetimes, people can do this
Yes.
stuff.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
is astonishing to me. I I suppose I have that capacity too. I'm a human, but I'm not good at that. I think
No.
like I don't know. I shouldn't say I don't know. I don't want to make myself sound holier than thou, but I think it would be very difficult for me to have a kind of double life or something like that.
Right. Yeah. My facade would crack. I may be able to hold it, whatever I'm trying to hide. I don't, a year, maybe,
Yeah.
but my
Maybe I
facade
could
would
manage
crack.
it for like 6 months to a year, maybe.
Yeah.
But some people just, I guess they have a higher capacity for it, or maybe things get so out of control at some point that you feel like you're in too deep and you just have to keep going with it.
Yeah.
But that's fascinating human behavior, and it's
Right.
fascinating also that it's so damn common.
I
Uh,
know.
I
Yeah.
mean, I don't know if there's anybody who lives a good number of years who doesn't experience some variation of that. And you do a good job of kind of portraying the way that that can kind of undo people. And it's also really interesting to think of deep secrets and this theme of the cost of keeping secrets in the context of a town like West Mills,
Hmm.
where there are fewer secrets between people because everybody is living in close proximity and there's a limited
Right.
number of people. It's harder to
Exactly.
keep a secret in a town like
Right.
South Mills or West Mills, right?
Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. If you want to have an affair, you could be dumb and you could just let everyone see you, you know, and
Right.
deal with it. Or you drive an hour away and you still might get caught, but it might take a little longer,
At least there's some buffer,
And
like in the
there's some buffer.
aftermath.
Exactly.
You have like 50 miles between you and
Right.
chaos. Uh,
Yeah.
so I want to talk with you about some craft stuff because I read some things about the way that you approach the work that I found interesting, and also they brought decent people into sharper focus for me because I think one of the strongest aspects of your work is your ear for dialogue and
Hmm.
the regional dialect. Like it feels just very lived in. These are the people you know. The sounds of the place are just something that you have a very firm grasp of. The
Thank you.
way that people talk, it shows up on the page. And I was reading about a conversation that you had with a writer friend of yours, I think an MFA classmate named Regina Porter,
Hmm.
who is a playwright as well.
Yes.
And she made a recommendation to you that I want to hear you talk about. I mean, maybe I can let you relay it. I'm sure you've told this story before. I know you've told this story before because I've read it, but
Yeah.
you'll probably do a better job than I would. But can you just talk about what insight she shared with you that helped you on your way?
Yeah, I was telling her this is, I think it was our maybe second semester, um, second or third semester in the program, and I told her, I said, I have, I know what my characters need to say in a scene. I know what needs to happen in a scene, but what slows me down is filling in the where they are, what they're wearing, and all that sort of thing, and not just setting, but just other exposition. And she said, well, don't worry about the exposition. She said, right now, she said, just write the dialogue. She said, if you have 1,000 pages of dialogue, let that be fine. And you go back later and you convert it. You add in what you need to add about setting and feelings and stuff that's not being conveyed from the dialogue. But right now, get that dialogue down. When you know if you know what your characters are saying to each other, let that lead you to the end. And I did that with in West Mills, and I did that largely with decent people. Yeah.
It's just you
Uh,
just wrote like in an early draft, you were basically just in all dialogue mode,
exactly. Exactly.
and
Maybe
that gave you your narrative.
it did. It did because what I would do is I would read a conversation. And so once I got to the end, I would go back and I would read a conversation. I thought, okay, if she said this in the kitchen, she might throw the napkin, when she said this word. So I'll make this conversation happen in the kitchen. And then then the little setting details come in and so on and so forth. But yeah, it really worked for me to have dialogue down first. It really did. And I think Regina being a playwright, and doing stage directions later after the heart of the play is written, I think that's where her advice comes from. And it has been incredibly, incredibly helpful.
And growing up in a place like South Mills, this is just my imagination of it. I mean, I grew up in some smaller suburbs, but I don't think as small as South Mills. What was the population
Mm,
about when you were growing up? Do you know?
I don't know. If I had to take a rough guess, though, maybe a few thousand.
Okay, so small.
It was small, yeah. So it would have been even smaller when my mother was growing up, you know.
But
Yeah.
my mother in particular is from a small town in Louisiana, and people, I'm imagining you growing up there. People talk a lot, maybe in
Hmm.
ways that they don't in big cities. Like I know people talk everywhere, but it's like
Yeah.
in the neighbors. It's a slower pace of life.
Right.
Maybe especially back in like the 70s and 80s, people hanging out in each other's yards. This is pre-cell
Yeah.
phone. People
Yeah.
chat. You grew up around people talking is the point.
Yes. Absolutely. People talk all the time. you know, and you go to the grocery store. I used to hate going to the grocery store with my mom because you stand in one aisle for 35 minutes because she ran into Miss Geneva, you know? And so they have to have their conversation. Then you go to
Right.
around the corner and she runs into Jimbo, you know? Then they have to have their 15-minute conversation. It's just talking, talking, talking.
I feel like that's my nightmare.
Yeah.
You can't go anywhere. I mean, it's like,
Right.
but it's also like a dream because it is nice to know people in your community. I can talk out of both sides of my mouth on this thing, but if you just want to go out and get groceries and come home
Yeah.
and you're
And
you're
come
on the
home.
clock, good
Exactly.
luck, man. You
Right.
because then if you like, I feel like I ran into this morning. I ran into somebody and I was like, I got to get back and get started with work. And I should have just said that. But why is it so hard for me to say that? I don't want to seem rude, but
Yeah.
I think I came off seeming rude because I wasn't just honest about the fact that I was on the clock. I was trying to like hurry up the conversation and,
Yeah.
but in a small town in the South, man, you got to be ready. And you as a little boy, I'm just picturing and you're a writer. Writers are good observers typically. And
Yeah.
you were listening is the point. You're
Yes.
always
Yeah, I
were
was.
tuned in.
Yeah, as much as I would be frustrated by it, I was also tuned in and paying attention. And I learned something like, one thing I say, and I can only say this because I know my mom won't listen to this podcast, but my
Never know.
mom,
You never know.
yeah,
She
it's
could be a
true.
fan.
Yeah. Um, you know, a lot of people that I grew up around were gossips, and so that wasn't anything special. But something that I learned from observing this gossip is I learned how the story is not that they change the story from one person to the next, but with one person, someone might get the full story, and with the next phone call, lots of would be omitted. And I used to wonder. Well, I wonder why my aunt told her girlfriend that part, but when she told my mom, she left out that part. You know, and then I start to, as an adult and as a writer, thinking back on these things. Oh, I see why my mom is her older sister, and she wants to appear a certain way to her older sister. But with her girlfriend, they're peers, they can be messy together, so she can tell her the whole story. You know,
Right.
and
The good version.
right, she could tell her the good version. So I learned that gossip is not just there's just not one type of gossip where a person tells a story and then it passes on. People are making conscious decisions when they gossip about who can handle what information and who they'll share, who they want to think highly of them. Therefore, I won't share the smutty parts. I'll share just the point. You know, I won't
Yeah.
get into the lurid because I enjoyed the lurid and I don't want her to know that you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So
people
there's this
tailor.
you're right, socio-dynamic stuff happening in gossip.
You must have been a pain to have around as a kid because you were listening and making these
Oh,
connections.
I was always being. My mother would be on the phone, be on the phone, and she could tell that I was listening, even though I was watching the TV. And she would say, "Hold on a second," and she would press the phone into her bosom, and then tell me, "I know you're sitting there listening. Go do such and such."
Right.
Yeah,
Be gone with you.
right. Yeah,
But it ended up serving you well, and I
it
think that
did.
you have to be a good listener to be a good writer. I don't think there's any way to do it
I
otherwise, or
agree.
at least that's some component of it. And
Yeah.
for you, it seems especially the case to be this talky in your approach to writing fiction. I don't think I've ever talked to a writer who, unless I didn't know it, who does it that way, writing
Mm,
out dialogue to begin with and then doing all expository writing in subsequent drafts.
yeah.
But it sounds, because I love to write dialogue, and it's like that might be the most pleasurable part of writing fiction for me is to write
Hmm.
dialogue. It seems like you're
Yeah.
obviously the same way, but
Yes.
maybe I should try that. Like just do an entire draft of dialogue and then figure out the rest based on
Yeah.
that.
It's going to be a large file, but you go back and convert it.
So you leave home at age 18 after high school and you
Hmm.
moved to, was it Durham?
Durham, North Carolina. Yeah.
And you said earlier you came out like within 6 months of leaving home. Was
Yes.
moving from South Mills to Durham a huge change for you at the time, like culturally?
Yeah, it's a bigger city and the university. So I went there to go to North Carolina Central University. But it's it's called the Triangle, the Research Triangle area. And so there's Chapel Hill, UNC Chapel Hill is right up the road, and Duke University was very close by. And then over in Raleigh you have those. So it felt like a New York City in North Carolina. I just met people from all different places. Um, I met lots of other queer people within the first month. I was going to clubs illegally within a few months of moving away. And
That was fast.
yeah,
You
I
figured that
was
out quick.
really quickly. Yeah, and so yeah, it was a big difference. I mean, I outgrew it quickly too. But moving from a small town like the Elizabeth City, South Mills area, and going to a place where it's like 10 universities in a few miles drive, it was a big deal. Yeah. It's the capital. Raleigh is the capital, and Durham's right next to it, and Chapel Hill. So yeah, that was really great. It was a really great experience. I made a lot of mistakes during those years, but I lived. And I when I moved here to New York, because I had gotten a lot of mess out of my system, I didn't come here and make all of those big city mistakes. you know,
Yeah.
I had
Right. You
I
had
had
like
to
the
sit
training, you had like the training wheels version in Durham,
exactly,
and then that got
exactly.
you ready for New York.
That's right.
We all have to, I mean, most people, I'm sort of fascinated by these people who never really had like big, messy years. Like they just sort
I
of always had
know.
their shit together. Like,
I know.
what's going on with those people?
Yeah, I don't. I stay away from them. Something not right.
Yeah, exactly. Who needs those people?
Yeah,
It's annoying.
they turn
Uh,
70 and then they want to party and stuff.
maybe. Well, listen, yeah, I just was talking to a friend of mine the other day, and he was telling me about like, he and his wife met through their son's school. They met this
Hmm.
couple who were Mormon. They had been Mormon.
Okay.
But then the wife decided she didn't want to be in the church. And there was this kind of like back and forth between husband and wife. And it caused like real marital tension.
Mm,
But then they went to marriage counseling,
okay.
and the marriage counselor suggested ketamine therapy. And it fucking worked like gangbusters. Like it totally deprogrammed the Mormon stuff. Like they're out, both of them.
Wow.
And now like they're super into cannabis, and like to the point where the guy is making his own gummies and shit. Like, it's like no one is more fervent in their belief than the recent
Yeah.
convert, so it's like this inverse of the religious experience. And so these are people in midlife who are now ex-Mormons
Hmm.
who are like going through a huge drug phase.
That's funny.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So you went after Durham to New York. Is that the trajectory? And then from New York to
Yes,
the Iowa Writers Workshop?
correct.
How was
Yeah,
Iowa for you?
it was fine. I mean, I met really lovely people there. I enjoyed I enjoyed 75, percent of my workshop experience. I don't love the workshop experience, to be honest. If anyone listens to this, it's a good thing I don't go in the academic job market much, because if anyone heard this, I wouldn't get any jobs. But if anyone, after application, read my application. Um, yeah, I'm not in love with the workshop concept at all,
Me
so
neither.
I didn't enjoy being workshopped much, like one time a semester is fine. After that, I'm like, okay, I know what you all like, so I know what you're going to say about my pages,
Well,
um,
well, and
but
I just want to interrupt because I feel like in the workshop experience, my problem with it is that the level of attention that you're getting from people varies so much.
exactly.
So some people, I mean, it's a pretty big ask to ask people to
Right.
go read 30 pages of your in process fiction and come back with
Yeah.
something intelligent to say about it. A lot of people skim over it, but then in
Right.
order to seem competent in workshop, will say something with this very definitive air.
Exactly.
That's not helpful to me. Like, I
No.
only want to hear from people who are actually invested in me and like
Right.
are giving me the straight shit and have really taken the time to read it. And
Yeah.
if that's the case, even if they have negative things to say, I'm there for it. But
I'm there for it.
what I don't like is when people did it the night before in a rush in 30
Hmm.
minutes and suddenly are an expert on my work. It's like, I don't know.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
And then
So
they want to compare you to writers you've never ever heard of, and I'm like, well, that doesn't help because I haven't read that book. Like, don't name drop.
right, right. Some
Yeah,
obscure Bulgarian novelist that like,
exactly.
yeah.
So, but I enjoyed being there to be around people who were also interested in doing the same thing, and you know, I feel like I can call on just about anybody that I went to that program with, and even people who graduated before me who still live there, and have a conversation. So it was really good, socially it was good. And I learned, I did write down some book recommendations and that sort of thing, and I've read some people I probably wouldn't have read previously. So it definitely was good. I'm
It's
not one of
sort
those people who thinks that writers should run out and apply to MFA programs. I
Me
know that
neither.
there's a business part to it that can be very helpful, and I benefited from that, but I just, I think if you got a good, I hate to use the word, but if you got a good product, you know, you just really, you go for it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you don't need yeah, I think it's kind of it's a nice to have. It's not a must have. And it can be
Right.
useful, like you say, socially, and it can be useful in terms of helping you build a network, which can otherwise be more difficult to build, because
Absolutely.
writers are kind of dispersed all over the place. Or even if you're in New York or something, you're in Brooklyn and there's lots of writers around, everyone's still in their little apartment and
Absolutely.
might not be connecting as much as one might think. And I feel like Iowa is sort of like it performs a similar function to like Saturday Night Live for comedians.
Hmm.
It's kind of like the place. Like if you graduate from Iowa, it's like a feather in your cap, and people in publishing will always maybe give you the time of day.
Yeah.
At least they'll at least give you a look, right?
They'll
But
give you a look.
and it's that network too. Like people who
Yeah.
graduated from Iowa, like feeling like a real affinity with other people who graduated from Iowa to a degree that maybe exceeds other MFA programs.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's been the case. And then,
Yeah.
you worked on your debut there. Is that where you wrote it?
Hmm. Yeah, I wrote it there. I think I started it during my second year, or in the break between first and second year, and I think I finished the first draft in my final semester and sent it out, and didn't have any luck, and went back to the drawing table and expanded it. It was a very short book, my first one, and but all the agents were like, it's too short. And I was like, no, it's not. Justin Torres's first book is, well, at that time he only had one. And I said, Justin
We the
Torres' book is
Animals.
We the Animals is 124 pages. Don't tell me, you know, that
Right.
my 130-page book is too short, But when 10 agents tell you it's too short, then you say, okay. And so I went back and I expanded it, and that's what it needed. Yeah, I was stubborn. I was stubborn. And I had in my mind that I wanted to publish before I turned 40. I ended up publishing when I turned 40
Close
instead of
enough.
before. Close enough.
Yeah. And now here
Yeah.
you are with the follow up.
Yeah.
Was it
Yeah.
harder to write the second novel than it was the first?
Yeah, I think it was. I would say it was harder. Hmm. Um, there was some comparisons I was making, and then I was also doing this thing where, because it was set in the same place, I didn't want to just sort of regurgitate, you know. Um, but I was also trying to make sure I was, even though I was using a few characters that had been introduced in West Mills, I wanted to make sure that they were different. I didn't want to, you know, the people in West Mills, um, they're all nice people. And I mean, my lead protagonist was a raging alcoholic. And I did not want to have like the raging alcoholic in the second book. I was like, these black people can have problems, but it's not going to be substance abuse, and it's not going to be having three babies with three different men. It's not going to be any of that. I'm going to have black people with money, but they can still have problems and they can
Right.
still deal with racism. Um, and I wanted to have white characters as well, but I wanted them to be more than just your southern racist white person. You know, I wanted them to be rounded, fully realized characters. And I wanted to make sure that I was true to the place and the time. I couldn't make them all be liberal, you know.
Right.
But I was like, I also don't have to write white characters who are all walking around with tiki torches. Like I can find a happy medium.
Right.
So yeah,
Right.
so
It's
that's
like
what I
it's
sought out to do.
that's my experience of people in general, but also, especially people in the South. I've spent a lot of time in the South, and like the tensions are real and they're there, and racism is real and it is definitely there,
Yeah,
but it's usually muddled.
right.
And
Exactly.
I mean, I've seen it in my own family over the years. As a kid, I was like, grandparents, very friendly with people in the neighborhood. And I always tell this story, but yet like wouldn't let me watch the Cosby Show. Like, I'm like,
Hmm.
what? Like it honestly didn't make much sense.
Yeah,
It was hard to square. It's still hard to square, but
right.
these things have deep roots, and
Absolutely.
they go back generations, and it's taught and handed down, and
Yeah.
who knows? But it's very deftly drawn in your book, and felt familiar to me in some way, and also nice to be in a small town in a
Mm,
novel, which doesn't happen as often as maybe it should.
right.
There are a lot of big cities in books, I feel like, at least the
Yeah.
ones that come across my desk. And it's not often that I'm reading books that are set in like the rural South in some small town, though, occasionally it happens. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm wondering if are you going to continue in that vein? Is West Mills like the place for you, or are you going to move out and go other places in your fiction?
I'm gonna move out. The book I'm working on now is set upstate New York because I lived up there briefly. Um, so I'm trying a new setting with the one I'm working on now. But I do think I will come back to West Mills. There are characters that I think I want to explore, previously introduced characters that I think I want to give them their own novel, even if it's just a short. Finally, one day someone will let me write the 125-page novel, and I think I'll go to I'll go to one of the characters from In West Mills who haven't quite left my mind, and give them their due. Yeah, I want to come back to the town.
How's writing upstate New York going for you? I'm thinking of your dialogue approach. Like, how's the talk in upstate New York going for you on the
Yeah,
page?
it's difficult. It's difficult. I am not using a ton of vernacular, um, I'm using I'm finding that I'm using a little bit of New York terminology, but most people sort of just talk standard English,
Right,
you
right.
know.
It's not a
But
secondhand. It's not nearly as secondhand for you as it is to write that North Carolina
exactly.
vernacular.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's difficult. It is difficult. Yeah. And there's a lot to learn because again, I only lived there for a year, and it's historical. So I have to, there's research to be done.
What can you tell me when it's set? Like what general time
Yeah,
period?
it's set in 80, right now it's 82,
Oh,
1982. Yeah. Um, and it's set in a town, it's set in Saugerties. Yeah.
all
Set
right.
in Saugerties.
Well, we'll look forward to it. It is a pleasure to meet you, and I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me. Congratulations on Decent People paperback edition, correct?
Yes, yes. Comes
All
out
right.
January 16th.
All right. Well, good luck with everything, and
Thank
appreciate the
you too,
time.
Brad. Thank you so much.